The engagement party in the Upper East Side penthouse was a symphony of crystal flutes and performative laughter, flawless on the surface. But when Elena leaned into Marcus's embrace, her gaze didn't rest on her fiancé. It drifted to the balcony door, tracking the shadow of the man who had just slipped away without a single word of protest. It was the quietest exit in the history of heartbreak, yet 5 years later, that silence would be the loudest thing in her life. If you find yourself drawn to the stories where the most painful scars are the ones that never bleed openly, stay with me, because we are about to unravel why she wishes he had screamed instead of leaving. The rain in Manhattan didn't wash things clean. It just made the city shine with a slick, deceptive gloss. Inside the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, the air was conditioned to a crisp 68 degrees, scented with expensive peonies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. Julian Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a flute of untouched sparkling water in his hand, watching the reflection of the room behind him. He looked like a man who belonged there. Fitted tuxedo, broad shoulders, a posture of easy confidence. But he felt like a ghost haunting his own funeral. Across the room, Elena was radiant. She wore a backless emerald gown that clung to her silhouette, a dress Julian had seen sketches of in a magazine she'd left on his coffee table 3 months ago. Now, Marcus Vane's hand rested heavily on the bare skin of her lower back, a proprietary claim that made Julian's jaw tighten imperceptibly. Marcus was laughing at something a hedge fund manager said, throwing his head back, exposing the column of his throat. He was handsome in the way a shark is handsome, sleek, predatory, and undeniably powerful. Elena laughed too, but her eyes weren't crinkled at the corners. They were scanning the room. When her gaze finally collided with Julian's in the reflection of the glass, she froze. For 3 years, Julian had been the one she called when her mother was sick, the one who edited her curator notes at 2 a.m., the one who knew she preferred her coffee lukewarm because hot liquids burned her tongue. But 3 weeks ago, Marcus had offered her the world, or at least the version of the world that glittered. Security, status, a reprieve from the grind of the mid-level art scene she had chosen. Julian turned away from the window and faced her. The noise of the party seemed to drop into a vacuum. He saw the subtle plea in her eyes, a silent beg for him not to make a scene, not to ruin her perfect night. She expected anger. She expected him to march over, to demand an explanation for why she hadn't answered his calls for 10 days, only to send him an invite to her engagement party as a brutal notification. He did none of that. Julian simply nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. An acknowledgement. I see you. I see your choice. I accept it. He placed his glass on a passing waiter's tray and walked toward the foyer. Julian? The voice was soft, barely audible over the jazz quartet playing in the corner. He stopped but didn't turn around. Elena had stepped away from Marcus, her hand hovering in the air, as if to reach for his sleeve, but stopping short. You're leaving? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The architecture of this room is suffocating, Elena, he said, his voice even, devoid of the malice she deserved. There's no structural integrity left. I wanted to talk to you, she whispered, glancing nervously back at Marcus, who was now holding court with a group of investors. About us, about why. There is no why that changes the outcome, Julian interrupted gently. He looked at her one last time, memorizing the lines of her face, not with longing, but with the clinical detachment of someone cataloging a loss. You made a calculation. I hope the math works out for you. He turned and walked to the elevator. The doors slid open with a soft chime. He stepped in and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, he saw Elena standing alone in the middle of the foyer, the emerald dress shimmering under the chandelier. She looked small. When he reached the lobby, he walked out into the cold October rain. He didn't hail a cab immediately. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolled to Elena, and pressed delete. Then he blocked the number. He walked 5 blocks in the rain until his tuxedo was soaked through, washing away the scent of her peonies. He went home, packed 2 suitcases, and booked a one-way ticket to Seattle on a flight leaving at 6 a.m. He didn't leave a note. He simply ceased to exist in her world. It was the quietest thing he had ever done. 5 years is a long time to hold your breath. Elena sat at the vanity table in the master bedroom, the cold surface of the marble pressing against her forearms. The room was expansive, a masterpiece of modern design featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Central Park bleeding into the twilight. It was the kind of view people killed for, the kind of view she had told herself she wanted. But tonight, the city lights below looked less like diamonds and more like the blinking eyes of a predator waiting in the dark. She applied her lipstick with surgical precision. Crimson, the shade Marcus liked. Not because he admired the color on her lips, but because it looked expensive in photographs. Behind her, the heavy oak door creaked open. Marcus walked in, loosening his tie. He smelled of scotch and that distinct, sterile scent of a private jet cabin. Or perhaps it was the perfume of the associate he had taken to the Hamptons for the weekend retreat. Elena didn't ask. She had learned by year 2 that asking questions only resulted in gaslighting disguised as concern for her mental health. "You're not ready?" Marcus asked, not looking at her. He was checking his emails, his thumbs flying across the screen of his phone. "The gala starts at 8, Marcus. It's barely 6:30, Elena replied, her voice steady. She watched him in the mirror. He was still handsome, perhaps even more so with the touch of gray at his temples, but his eyes were hard. They were eyes that assessed value, not humanity. "We need to be there for the pre-reception photos," he said, finally looking up. His gaze swept over her, critical and detached. "Wear the diamond choker, the Cartier one. The press will be looking for statement pieces tonight." He didn't say, "You look beautiful." He didn't kiss her cheek. He walked into the walk-in closet, and Elena heard the distinct sound of him tossing his phone onto the leather ottoman before closing the door. She opened the top drawer of her vanity to retrieve the choker. Her fingers brushed against the velvet box, but then paused. Tucked far in the back, beneath a stack of silk scarves she never wore, was a small, tattered moleskin notebook. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a sudden, violent rhythm that felt foreign in this quiet room. She pulled it out. It was a sketchbook Julian had left behind. Not the one with his architectural drafts, but the one filled with sketches of her. She opened it to a random page. It was a drawing of her sleeping on their old, lumpy sofa in the tiny Brooklyn apartment they had shared years ago. The caption, written in his neat, blocky handwriting, read simply, "Sunday morning. Peace." There were no diamonds in the sketch, no designer gowns, just messy hair, a cotton t-shirt, and a line quality so tender it made her throat ache. "Elena," Marcus's voice boomed from the closet. "Where are my cufflinks? The onyx ones." Elena slammed the notebook shut and shoved it back under the scarves. The sudden motion knocked a bottle of perfume over, the glass clinking sharply against the marble. "Coming," she called out. She forced her hands to stop trembling as she clasped the heavy diamond choker around her neck. Ideally, it should have felt like a gift. Instead, as the cold metal settled against her throat, it felt remarkably like a collar. 10 minutes later, they were in the elevator descending to the garage. Marcus stood close to her, his hand resting on the small of her back. To the security camera in the corner, it looked like intimacy. To Elena, his touch was heavy, possessive, and entirely devoid of warmth. As the elevator doors opened, Marcus pulled out his phone. "Smile," he commanded softly, raising the device. Elena tilted her head, the practiced smile stretching her lips automatically. Flash. Perfect, Marcus muttered, typing out a caption. Another night conquering the world with my better half. Power couple. Nachne no I see. He posted it before they even reached the limousine. Elena looked at the screen of her own phone a moment later. The likes were already pouring in. Hundreds of people envying a happiness that didn't exist. She turned to look out the window as the car merged into the traffic of Fifth Avenue. The rain had started again, just like that night 5 years ago. Somewhere in this city, or perhaps 1,000 miles away, Julian was existing. Was he looking at the rain? Was he happy? The silence in the car was deafening. Marcus was already on a call, discussing mergers and acquisitions. Elena closed her eyes, and for a fleeting second, she wished the car would keep driving, past the gala, past the city limits, until the suffocating weight of the diamonds on her neck simply fell away. But the car slowed down. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi were waiting. "Showtime, darling," Marcus said, ending his call. Elena opened her eyes. The mask slipped back into place. "Showtime," she echoed. The lobby of the Aesthetics Now magazine headquarters was all polished concrete and harsh halogen light, designed to look serious and expensive. Elena was waiting for her appointment with the editor-in-chief, trying to focus on a spreadsheet detailing the cost analysis for her upcoming gallery show. It was a tedious task, far removed from the passion she once felt for discovering new artists. Now, art was leverage, a social currency Marcus could exploit. She reached for a copy of Architectural Digest on the glass coffee table, purely as a distraction from the numbers. The cover, however, delivered a shock more profound than any financial crisis. Julian Thorne stared back at her. The image wasn't a casual headshot. It was a meticulously composed portrait. Julian stood against the backdrop of a sprawling, futuristic model of a skyscraper, his profile sharp and commanding. He was older, the boyish softness around his eyes replaced by a quiet authority. He wore a simple dark suit, but it possessed an effortless elegance that Marcus's custom-tailored Italian wear always seemed to lack. The headline, stark white against the matte black of his jacket, screamed, "Thorne's Silence, the architect redefining the skyline." Elena felt the blood rush from her face, leaving a cold, hollow sensation in her chest. For 5 years, Julian had been a silence, a regret she had successfully filed away in the deepest recesses of her mind, a comfortable assumption that he had moved on, perhaps to a smaller firm, perhaps teaching somewhere quiet in the Pacific Northwest. She had never allowed herself to contemplate this. Triumph. She flipped the magazine open, her fingers trembling. The article detailed Julian's meteoric rise since leaving New York, a prize-winning museum in London, an eco-village concept in Zurich, and now, the crown jewel, the commission to design the new Nexus Tower, a colossal billion-dollar structure that would dominate the skyline of Midtown Manhattan. Thorne's design philosophy is rooted in authenticity and structural integrity, a direct reaction to the empty, performative architecture of the previous decade, the writer gushed. The words felt like a direct, personalized attack. Empty, performative. That was her life. That was Marcus. Elena looked at the accompanying photo spread. There was Julian in his Seattle office, minimalist and flooded with natural light. A candid shot showed him laughing easily with a female colleague, a landscape architect with bright, honest eyes. There was no diamond choker, no forced smile, just an atmosphere of genuine, focused passion. She was suddenly overwhelmed by the smell of peonies and the sound of silence from that fateful night. When Julian left, she hadn't just lost a man. She had lost her conscience, the structural integrity of her own life. She thought of Marcus, who was currently embroiled in a discreet but vicious internal struggle at his firm, his temper growing shorter, his whispers of business opportunities becoming louder and more desperate. Marcus, whose success felt built on sand. Julian, whose success was built on bedrock. Ms. Vane? The editor's assistant was standing over her. Elena quickly closed the magazine, the crisp sound startlingly loud in the quiet lobby. She tucked the magazine under her arm, an unconscious, possessive gesture. "I'm ready," Elena said, standing up. Her voice was too bright, too steady. As she walked down the polished corridor, she knew she had just received an unexpected invitation, not to a party, but to a confrontation. Julian wasn't just back in the city. He was about to build his legacy on the horizon she stared at every morning. He was no longer a ghost. He was an indelible, rising presence. And inevitably, their orbits would intersect again. The thought brought her a terrifying mix of dread and exhilaration. She clutched the magazine tighter. She needed to understand the man he had become, because the man he had been was the only thing she truly regretted losing. The fundraising gala was held in the marble-clad hall of a prestigious Upper East Side museum, a fortress of old money and newer ambitions. Elena was wearing a simple, elegant black dress, but her usual confidence was a fragile thing tonight, shattered by the memory of Julian's face on the magazine cover. She had been tracking his movements, the news announcements, the architectural buzz, with a nervous intensity that Marcus, busy negotiating a new seed round for a dubious tech firm, hadn't noticed. She saw him the moment he stepped through the archway. He wasn't making an entrance. He simply was there. Julian stood near a large Rothko painting, seemingly studying the depth of the color fields, but in his tailored suit, he was the most arresting piece of art in the room. He moved with a new kind of grace, one that spoke not of eagerness or ambition, but of quiet, settled power. Marcus, sensing a profitable networking opportunity, immediately tugged Elena's arm. "That's Thorne," he murmured, his voice laced with forced casualness. "The Architectural Digest guy. He's connected to half the development funds downtown. Come on, let's make an introduction." Elena's breath hitched. "Marcus, maybe later?" "Nonsense, darling. Too much to lose later." Marcus steered her across the crowded floor with his hand pressed firmly against the small of her back. When they reached him, Julian finally looked up from the painting. His gaze passed over Elena, a quick, blank assessment, before settling squarely on Marcus. There was no flicker of recognition, no residual pain, no trace of the man who had loved her fiercely in a dilapidated Brooklyn walk-up. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus boomed, extending a hand. "Marcus Vane. Vane Capital. This is my wife, Elena. She runs the Rostova Gallery downtown." Julian's handshake was firm, brief, and utterly impersonal. "Mr. Vane, a pleasure." He nodded to Elena, a mere social courtesy. "Ms. Vane?" He pronounced her name as though they had just met, the lack of intimacy in his tone more painful than any shouted accusation could have been. "I see you're back in the city," Marcus continued, trying to establish dominance through conversation. "Big project, I hear. You know, I had a chance to invest in that lot years ago. Missed opportunity, but that's the market." Julian smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Architecture is a slow game, Mr. Vane. It requires patience and a commitment to the long-term structure. Not every venture is built on rapid exits." The thinly veiled jab at Marcus's fast, often unethical VC strategies landed squarely. Marcus bristled, but before he could retaliate, Julian turned his attention back to the Rothko, effectively closing the conversation. "If you'll excuse me," Julian said smoothly, "I was just being briefed on the provenance of this piece. Fascinating color theory." He looked at the painting, then at Marcus, and finally, for a split second, his eyes met Elena's. This time, the lack of recognition was deliberate. It was the absolute, total erasure of history. Elena felt the entire room tilt. Marcus was fuming, his face red, but Julian had already melted back into the crowd, walking toward a prominent developer who greeted him with genuine warmth. "Arrogant prick," Marcus spat under his breath. "Thinks he's too good for quick money. He'll learn." Elena didn't respond. She stood motionless, the choker feeling heavy and suffocating again. She hadn't wanted him to beg or fight for her 5 years ago, but she had never anticipated this. The profound indifference of a man who had once studied the curve of her spine the way he now studied architectural blueprints. Julian's quiet departure years ago had been an act of dignity. His silence tonight was a declaration. You are not important enough to hate. The pain was sharp, immediate, and deep. It wasn't the pain of a lover scorned. It was the chilling realization that she had chosen a superficial, temporary pedestal over a man built of substance, and in doing so, had forfeited her place in his authentic, soaring life forever. She had regretted her choice before, but tonight, seeing Julian, she regretted the consequences of that choice, and the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. A week after the gala, Elena's life had fractured into 3 distinct realities. The first was the public reality: flawless Instagram posts, mandatory charity lunches, and the illusion of the city's perfect power couple. The second was the marital reality: Marcus's increasing paranoia about his firm's internal review, late-night arguments conducted in low, venomous whispers, and the lingering, sweet, sickly scent of a perfume that wasn't hers on his shirts. The third, and most consuming, was the Julian reality. She had spent days obsessively reviewing the public filings for the Nexus Tower. Her initial professional objective was to find a reason, any reason, to initiate a legitimate conversation with Julian Thorne, the celebrated architect. She needed to understand the man he was now, hoping to find a vulnerability, a crack she could exploit to force him to acknowledge the debt of their shared past. She found none. His plans were impeccable, his contracts ironclad, his partnerships reputable. Everything Julian touched was built with the integrity he had once offered her. It was in stark contrast to the shifting foundation of Marcus's world. One evening, Elena was meticulously arranging a shipment of fragile Venetian glass sculptures for her gallery when Marcus stormed in, slamming the front door of their apartment with unusual violence. "The audit is a farce," he growled, ripping off his tie. He threw it across the room. "The board is questioning my leverage on the Tokyo deal. They're looking for a scapegoat, Elena, and they think I'm it." He didn't seek comfort. He sought an audience for his rage. Did you cut any corners on the financing?" Elena asked cautiously. She hated herself for even asking, for conceding that the possibility was real. Marcus's eyes, usually calculating, were wild. "We operate in a gray area, Elena. That's how we win. That's why you have that ring. Don't play naive with me." He jabbed his finger toward her, the motion sharp and accusatory. "Your job is to smile and look expensive at the fundraisers, not to ask questions you can't understand." The words were an old wound, freshly reopened. It wasn't the verbal abuse that stung most. It was the realization that the man she had chosen for his perceived stability was the most structurally unsound element in her life. The foundation was crumbling, and the cost of the collapse would be social ruin. That night, lying awake next to Marcus's heavy, indifferent breathing, Elena made a decision. She couldn't afford to be passive anymore. She pulled out her laptop and drafted an email. It was formal, professional, and entirely focused on business. Subject: potential collaboration, Nexus Tower, art integration. She proposed a meeting to discuss curating the public art spaces within the Nexus Tower, framing it as a mutually beneficial opportunity for his firm's prestige and her gallery's exposure. She used all the right buzzwords: synergy, community engagement, brand messaging. She proofread it 5 times, removing every hint of personal history or desperate longing. Then she pressed send. The response came 45 minutes later, delivered from a generic administrative account. It was brief. Ms. Vane, Mr. Thorne thanks you for your interest. All artistic integration is handled by a third-party consultant. We will forward your proposal. Best regards. No signature from Julian. No personal note. Not even a single word acknowledging the woman he had once shared a future with. The rejection was polite, decisive, and delivered through an impenetrable administrative shield. The coldness was absolute. He had sealed himself off, not with anger, but with efficiency. Julian Thorne had not only moved on, he had built walls so high and so solid that her past self, the one who had discarded him for shiny facades, couldn't even reach the foundation. Elena stared at the screen, the sterile text confirming her deepest fear. Julian was unreachable, and her gilded cage was rapidly turning into a very public, very lonely trap. The fight was spectacular, terrifying, and utterly private. It started with a certified letter addressed to Marcus, delivered by a messenger who looked nervous just standing in their hallway. The letter outlined the preliminary findings of the regulatory review. It was not favorable. Marcus didn't break glass. He broke silence. "This is your fault," he hissed, his voice dangerously low, standing too close to Elena in the pristine living room. "You insisted on that damn art show last month instead of focusing on the charities that matter. You distract me, you're a liability." "I am a distraction," Elena retaliated, her voice raw. "You've been out of town 4 nights this week. I saw the charge on the corporate card, a hotel suite in Miami. Was that for the audit team, Marcus, or for your new associate?" Marcus flinched, not from guilt, but from the sudden, sharp breach of their unspoken contract. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard enough to bruise. "You don't get to look for faults, Elena. You get to play your part. I provide the life. You provide the illusion. You broke the illusion." He threw her arm away, the force sending her stumbling back against a silk-draped console. The shock was paralyzing. He didn't hit her, but the psychological violence was just as shattering. Marcus glared at her, adjusted his expensive silk robe, and stalked into his separate study, slamming the heavy door behind him. Elena stood there, utterly alone in the mansion she couldn't afford to leave. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, smudged mascara, a tear track cutting through her makeup. She realized she was not just trapped by the money. She was trapped by the sheer emptiness of her soul. She couldn't call a friend. They were all Marcus's friends. She couldn't call her mother. She adored Marcus. There was only one person in the world who had ever seen her completely, flawed and vulnerable, and who had never asked her to put on a show. Without thinking, driven by a primal need for sanctuary, she grabbed her coat and keys. Julian lived in a loft conversion downtown, a space she found through a mutual acquaintance's social media tag. It was industrial chic, softened by bookshelves and deep velvet furniture. She stood outside the main entrance at 11:45 p.m., the cool autumn air biting at her exposed skin. She pressed the buzzer for Thorne Architecture, her finger shaking. "Yes?" Julian's voice, crisp and calm, came through the intercom. "It's Elena," she whispered, her voice cracking with shame. A long, painful silence stretched across the wire, filled only by the distant hum of the city. She expected him to refuse, to hang up, to give her the justified condemnation she deserved. Instead, the magnetic lock clicked open. Elena took the elevator up to his floor. When the door opened, Julian was standing in the hallway. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, looking approachable, yet utterly formidable. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, held a flicker of something she couldn't name. Pity, perhaps, or weariness. "Elena," he said, his tone flat, "this is a boundary you shouldn't have crossed." She ignored the words. She stepped forward, past the threshold, and leaned against the cold plaster wall, struggling to breathe. I needed to see you," she choked out, fighting the urge to dissolve into tears. "I needed to see someone real. Marcus, he hates me. And I think I hate him, Julian. I made a terrible, vulgar mistake. I chose the wrong man." She looked up at him, begging for the rage he had withheld 5 years ago. "Why didn't you fight? Why did you just let me go?" Julian didn't move. He stood tall, blocking the entrance to the main living area. He didn't offer a tissue or a drink. He simply looked at the wreck she had become. "I left quietly," Julian said, his voice measured and low, "because a true choice isn't something you fight over. You chose the life you valued. And 5 years ago, I promised myself I would never again stand in a room where I wasn't valued." He paused, letting the truth sink into her bones. "I am sorry that your calculations were wrong, Elena, but this is where the story ends for us." The silence in Julian's loft stretched taut, thicker than the expensive air filter could clean. Elena stood shivering, not just from the cold night air clinging to her coat, but from the raw exposure of her confession. She looked at Julian, the man who had loved her without condition, and saw a vast, empty distance. "You hope my calculations were wrong," Elena repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You hope the math doesn't work out. Isn't that what you want? To see me suffer for choosing the money?" "I don't wish you suffering, Elena," Julian said, his voice flat. "I just don't feel anything about your suffering. That is the crucial difference. I left you the space to own your choice, not to come back and demand I validate your regret." She took a desperate step closer. "But why? Why didn't you fight for me? Yell at me? Why did you just disappear? If you had given me one argument, one fight—" "I was never going to beg you to see my value," Julian interrupted, his eyes finally locking onto hers, and they held an intensity that finally shattered her composure. "You stood between two men, Elena. One offered you a future built on genuine partnership and quiet integrity. The other offered you prestige and safety. And you chose the man who offered the clearest escape from the difficult work of building something real. My silence wasn't weak. It was the strongest respect I could offer your autonomy." Tears streamed down her face, ruining the perfect makeup she had applied hours ago for Marcus. "I was scared, Julian. Scared of not being enough. Scared of the struggle. We all are," he conceded, but without softening his gaze. "The difference is that some of us face that fear by working harder, and others try to buy their way out of it." Elena sank onto the edge of the sleek sofa, her shoulders hunched. This was the moment of complete surrender. "I know I can't take back 5 years, but I'm asking for a second chance. I'll leave him. I'll give up the penthouse. I don't need the money. I just need you. I need the peace we had. Please, Julian." She waited for a sign, a hand reaching out, a flicker of the old love. Julian didn't move. He walked over to a high console table and picked up a simple, unframed photograph. He held it, looking at it for a long moment before finally turning back to her. "When I left here 5 years ago, I didn't spend the next year mourning you. I mourned the future I had imagined. And then I started building a new one," he said, his voice softer now, but infinitely more final. "I found someone, Elena. Someone who understands that life isn't about the surface, but the foundation." He laid the photograph down, allowing her to see it. It was a picture of him and the landscape architect from the magazine Sophie. They were standing on a windswept cliff, laughing, their hands loosely intertwined. Her eyes were wide and honest, and Julian was looking at her with an easy, deep affection that Elena realized he had never quite reserved for her. "She chose me, Elena," Julian continued, the words a quiet knife to her heart. "Not for the building, not for the awards, but for the man sitting across the table, drawing lines on paper. She is a collaborator, a partner. She is the structure that my life needed." He looked directly at her, his expression now one of gentle dismissal. "The love I had for you died on the night you chose Marcus. It didn't turn to hate. It simply ceased to exist. You are asking me to tear down a beautiful, stable structure to rebuild something that proved fragile and unreliable. I won't do that." Elena rose, leaning on the back of the sofa for support. There were no more tears left. The rejection wasn't angry. It was factual. It was the absolute heartbreaking truth of consequence. "I see," she whispered. She understood now. Her punishment wasn't her empty marriage. It was Julian's undeniable, peaceful happiness without her. The walk back to the Upper East Side was the longest journey Elena had ever taken. The city was stirring to life. The cacophony of sirens, delivery trucks, and early commuters. But the world felt muffled and distant. She was still wearing the clothes from the night before, a silent testament to her failure. She didn't feel rage or despair. She felt a profound, chilling clarity. Julian's quiet refusal had stripped away every layer of illusion, leaving her exposed to the truth. Her unhappiness was not his responsibility, and her redemption had to be her own project. When she stepped into the penthouse, Marcus was already awake, pacing the living room floor and talking loudly on the phone, oblivious to her absence. He hung up abruptly when he saw her. "Where in the hell have you been, Elena?" Marcus demanded, his voice dangerously strained. "I called your cell 5 times. You know how close we are to a disaster. This behavior—" "I was out," Elena cut him off, her voice startlingly calm. She walked past him, dropping her coat onto the back of a chaise lounge. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were steady. Marcus followed her into the kitchen, his paranoia spiking. "Out where? With whom? Was it about the audit? Did you talk to anyone who could compromise our position?" Elena poured herself a glass of water. She didn't flinch. She realized, with sudden, absolute conviction, that she no longer feared his anger or his threats of financial ruin. She had just faced the ultimate loss, the death of her last hope, and everything else felt trivial. "I talked to a friend," Elena said, taking a deliberate sip of water. "I talked to someone who reminded me what structural integrity looks like, and I've decided this marriage has none." Marcus paused, momentarily stunned by the change in her demeanor. "What are you talking about? Are you having an emotional breakdown? We have a life to maintain, Elena. You can't just—" "I want a divorce, Marcus." The words were simple, stated like a fact of physics. The shock finally registered on his face, momentarily erasing the perpetual sneer of entitlement. "Don't be ridiculous," Marcus scoffed, regaining his composure. "You walk away from me now. You get nothing. The assets are tied up in corporate trusts. You get alimony scraps and a massive social hit. You lose everything you chose me for." Elena set the glass down. The sound of ceramic hitting marble echoed loudly. "I know, and I've accepted that. I chose this gilded cage, and now I'm choosing to walk out, even if the only thing waiting for me is the sidewalk." She knew the fight would be brutal, public, and financially devastating. She would lose the apartment, the endless credit lines, and probably half her social contacts. But as she looked at Marcus, really saw him, small, angry, and drowning in his own greed, the price suddenly seemed worth paying. Later that afternoon, after she had called a divorce attorney recommended by a trusted colleague, someone Marcus didn't know, Elena stood alone in her dressing room. She opened the top drawer of the vanity and pulled out the old moleskin sketchbook. She flipped through the familiar lines and sketches of Julian's quiet passion. She had wanted him back, hoping he could save her. But Julian, in his stoic refusal, had given her something far more important than rescue. He had given her the courage to save herself. His exit, quiet and dignified, had taught her the ultimate lesson. You don't fight for things that don't fight for you. And if the foundation is rotten, you tear it down and start over. Elena put the notebook in a small carry-all bag, the only piece of luggage she was packing for the night. She looked around the expansive, soulless room one last time, a prisoner choosing freedom. She walked out of the penthouse. The city was exactly as she had left it, indifferent and daunting. But for the first time in 5 years, the air felt cooler, and the light felt real. The process of rebuilding would be long and agonizing, line by line, column by column. She didn't know what her life would look like, but she knew it would be her own. She stepped onto the street, closed the heavy door behind her, and walked toward the direction of her own future, alone.